Benin goes dark, borders tighten, sanctions bite, and in that moment, the plan was simple. Choke the Sahel, collapse the regime, force submission. Landlocked, isolated, finished. That was the assumption. But what if the blockade didn't break Burkina Faso? What if it triggered something far more dangerous, a silent rerouting of power? While cameras focused on closed corridors through Cotonou, a new artery was quietly forming. Convoys rolled, drones hovered, a different port surged. Trade didn't die, it moved. And when geography itself is weaponized, whoever redraws, the map wins. The question is, did Traoré just outmaneuver the entire region? When the economic community of West African states moved to enforce sweeping sanctions in 2023 and sustain them into 2024, the calculation was blunt. Landlocked Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger, would be cut off from their traditional Atlantic trade lifelines through Cotonou and Abidjan. Their economies would constrict under pressure, and political collapse would follow. The strategy hinged on geography. Burkina Faso has no coastline. Its imports of fuel, machinery, medicine, and staple goods, and its exports, especially gold and agricultural commodities, have historically depended on corridors running south to the ports of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire and Cotonou in Benin. Interrupt those arteries, and the state's economic bloodstream tightens. But what unfolded did not match the script many regional observers anticipated. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the response was not surrender. It was redirection. And that redirection began to reshape West Africa's trade map in ways few had fully predicted. To understand why this moment matters, you have to start with the structural vulnerability at the heart of the Sahel. Landlocked states in West Africa are not merely dependent on coastal neighbors for convenience. They are structurally tethered to them. Transit agreements, customs harmonization, trucking unions, warehousing networks, insurance systems, and banking channels have, for decades, been built around predictable southbound flows. Burkina Faso's commercial ecosystem evolved with Abidjan and Cotonou as anchors. When ECOWAS sanctions tightened after successive military takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the enforcement mechanism exploited this dependency. Borders closed. Financial channels narrowed. Political isolation deepened. The assumption was that economic distress would translate into political concessions. Yet coercion, through geography, carries risk. It assumes the absence of viable alternatives or the inability to mobilize them quickly. Instead of capitulating, Burkina Faso and its Sahelian counterparts began recalibrating their logistics architecture. The pivot point was Togo and the Port of Lomé. Unlike some neighboring coastal states that aligned closely with a strict enforcement posture, Togo maintained a more pragmatic stance, keeping trade channels open. Lomé did not become a rhetorical symbol. It became an operational solution. Ships continued to dock. Containers were redirected. Transit documentation was reworked. What initially looked like a temporary workaround started to crystallize into a strategic corridor. The distance from Lomé to Ouagadougou approaches 1,000 kilometers, cutting through terrain that has not been immune to insecurity and insurgent activity. This was not a frictionless highway designed for geopolitical standoffs. It required protection, coordination, and speed. That is where the so-called Iron Snake emerged, massive military-escorted convoys transporting fuel tankers, food supplies, pharmaceuticals, and industrial inputs across the corridor. Armored units accompanied the trucks. Surveillance drones monitored routes from above. Checkpoints were reinforced. Convoy movements were synchronized to reduce vulnerability. This was logistics under pressure, executed with visible security layering. The objective extended beyond delivery. It was to ensure continuity under duress and to signal resolve. Each convoy that reached Ouagadougou without disruption reinforced a narrative of resilience. Yet logistics at scale demands institutional adaptation. Burkina Faso accelerated the development and operationalization of inland dry ports in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso. These facilities were not cosmetic infrastructure projects. They functioned as customs clearance hubs designed to shift administrative authority inland. Instead of processing goods entirely at coastal entry points, clearance procedures were increasingly anchored within Sahelian territory. This reduced dependency on potentially hostile bureaucratic environments and allowed greater control over revenue capture. Customs duties, fees, and inspection regimes are not abstract line items. They are fiscal lifelines. By relocating portions of that apparatus inland, the government reclaimed administrative leverage. While traffic through Cotonou experienced slowdown and Benin's logistics sector felt contraction, Lomé's throughput surged. Containers once routed toward Abidjan were recalculated and redirected. Shipping lines adjusted risk assessments. Insurance models shifted to reflect convoy protection. Trucking associations realigned operations. The regional trade rhythm changed. What was intended to isolate instead triggered reconfiguration. This does not mean sanctions had no impact. Financial strain persisted. Transport costs were not negligible. Military escorts consume fuel and resources. Roads endure heavier where under intensified use. But total suffocation did not materialize. That distinction is critical. The corridor through Lomé functioned as a pressure valve. It did not erase economic stress, but it prevented systemic collapse. In geopolitics, preventing collapse can be as strategically decisive as achieving growth. The implications ripple beyond Burkina Faso alone. Mali and Niger share similar structural vulnerabilities. Their observation of Burkina Faso's adaptation reinforced a broader Sahelian lesson. Alternatives can be engineered under constraint, provided there is coordination and political will. This raises an uncomfortable question for sanction architects. If coercive measures rely on choke points, what happens when choke points are bypassed? Sanctions remain a potent diplomatic tool, but their effectiveness depends on comprehensive alignment and the absence of viable detours. Togo's pragmatic positioning complicated the isolation strategy. Lomé's expanding role translated into increased port activity, associated employment, and ancillary service demand. Infrastructure investment incentives grew stronger. Meanwhile, economic slowdown in Benin's transit sector illustrated the interdependence embedded in regional trade systems. When transit cargo shifts, revenue shifts. When revenue shifts, political calculations shift. This episode underscores the risks inherent in weaponizing geography. Ports and corridors are instruments of influence, but they are also nodes in complex economic ecosystems. When pressure is applied, those ecosystems adapt if given room to maneuver. The inland dry ports symbolize that adaptation vividly. Customs officials operating in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso processing shipments that originated in Lomé represent more than bureaucratic reshuffling. They represent an assertion of sovereignty over supply chains. For domestic audiences, the visual of secured convoys arriving intact reinforced a narrative of strategic autonomy. For external observers, it signaled that isolation was not absolute. Yet sustainability remains the pivotal variable. Maintaining a heavily escorted corridor across nearly 1,000 kilometers requires persistent resource allocation. Security threats evolve. Insurgent groups may identify convoys as strategic targets. Insurance premiums can rise if incidents occur. The durability of this reconfigured trade axis depends on continued coordination between security forces, customs authorities, transport unions, and Togolese counterparts. If any link weakens, costs could escalate. Still, the broader structural shift has already altered expectations. Investors and commodity traders value predictability. If Lomé consistently demonstrates reliability as a transit gateway for the Sahel, longer-term contracts and infrastructure commitments may follow. Rail feasibility discussions, road upgrades, warehousing expansion, and digital customs systems could entrench the corridor's permanence. Once entrenched, trade routes rarely revert fully without strong incentive. This prompts a deeper analytical reflection. Was the sanctions regime calibrated to anticipate adaptive resilience? Or did it assume linear economic decline? The answer may shape future regional policy design. Economic coercion can generate leverage, but it can also incentivize self-sufficiency efforts that reduce future leverage. In Burkina Faso's case, the attempt to constrict maritime access accelerated inland capacity building and diversified coastal partnerships. That is not a theoretical outcome. It is visible in cargo flows and administrative restructuring. The strategic messaging embedded in these developments matters. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government could point to operational continuity despite external pressure. Continuity in supply chains under sanctioned conditions strengthens domestic legitimacy narratives. However, legitimacy derived from resilience must eventually translate into broader economic performance. Securing fuel and food is foundational, but long-term development requires cost efficiency, industrial growth, and export competitiveness. The Lomé corridor provides breathing room. It does not automatically deliver transformation. This is where the stakes extend beyond immediate crisis management. If the Sahelian states invest in corridor modernization, streamlining customs digitalization, improving road durability, integrating security intelligence sharing, and reducing transit time, the redirection could evolve into structural integration. If not, it may remain an emergency workaround vulnerable to future shocks. Regional diplomacy will also adapt. Coastal states compete for transit cargo. Transit cargo generates leverage. As Lomé's profile rises, other ports may recalibrate engagement strategies. ECOWAS itself may reassess enforcement dynamics in light of adaptive responses. The balance between normative pressure and economic interdependence is delicate. Too much coercion risks fragmentation. Too little risks eroding collective standards. The episode highlights the complexity of regional governance in West Africa's volatile political landscape. For viewers analyzing this shift, one question persists. Is this the beginning of a durable eastward tilt in Sahelian trade orientation, or a temporary anomaly driven by exceptional sanctions? The answer will depend on security stabilization, infrastructure scaling, and diplomatic recalibration. The Iron Snake, convoys moving under armed escort, remain the most visible symbol of this transitional period. They illustrate both vulnerability and agency. Vulnerability because heavy escort implies risk. Agency because movement continues despite that risk. Every successful convoy undercuts the premise of inevitable economic asphyxiation. But the convoys are only one layer. Beneath them lies institutional adaptation, customs reorganization, port coordination, revenue management reforms. Those layers are less visible on camera, but more consequential over time. Trade maps are not static. They respond to incentives, risks, and political currents. The sanctions period forced a rapid redrawing of lines that had been stable for decades. Whether those lines remain redrawn depends on choices made in the coming years. If Lomé cements itself as the primary maritime gateway for Burkina Faso and possibly for segments of Mali and Niger, West Africa's logistical center of gravity subtly shifts. That shift could influence investment flows, diplomatic alignments, and security cooperation patterns. If traditional corridors reopen under improved political conditions, diversification may still endure as a hedge against future isolation. In either scenario, the assumption that landlocked geography equals total vulnerability has been challenged. The Sahel did not suffocate. It built a new corridor to the sea. That corridor emerged under constraint, protected by convoys and drones, anchored by inland dry ports reclaiming customs authority, and facilitated by a coastal partner choosing pragmatism over alignment with isolation. The broader geopolitical implication is clear. Economic blockades in interconnected regions can trigger innovation that reshapes structural dependencies. Pressure can fracture systems, but it can also reconfigure them. As West Africa navigates its evolving political landscape, this episode will remain a case study in adaptive logistics under sanction pressure. The ultimate outcome is still unfolding. Sustainability, cost efficiency, and regional diplomacy will determine whether this redirection becomes permanent architecture or transitional improvisation. But one fact is no longer speculative. A strategy designed to isolate the Sahel instead compelled it to re-engineer its access to global markets. And once a new path to the sea is carved and tested under pressure, it is rarely forgotten. As this new corridor consolidates, The deeper geopolitical ramifications extend far beyond the immediate survival calculus of sanctioned states, because what Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger, effectively demonstrated was that economic containment in West Africa operates within a fluid ecosystem rather than a sealed chamber, and fluid systems adapt when pressure is unevenly applied. The reliance on the Port of Lomé did more than reroute cargo. It subtly rebalanced influence along the Gulf of Guinea, elevating Togo's strategic relevance at a moment when coastal leverage was expected to discipline inland regimes. Transit trade is not merely about containers and custom stamps. It generates diplomatic capital, bargaining power, and long-term infrastructural gravity. As cargo volumes through Lomé increased, so too did the port's importance to shipping consortia, freight forwarders, and insurance markets assessing regional risk. Over time, such shifts can attract warehousing investment, bonded logistics parks, and digital tracking systems that embed new patterns of dependency. For Burkina Faso, expanding inland dry ports in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso signaled an attempt to internalize more value within national borders, reducing exposure to political friction at coastal checkpoints and ensuring that customs revenue, inspection authority, and administrative oversight were anchored domestically rather than externally mediated. This internalization of process matters because fiscal sovereignty often hinges on the mundane mechanics of paperwork, taxation, and clearance times. When goods are delayed, economies absorb cost. When goods are processed efficiently under domestic authority, states recover leverage. The Iron Snake convoys, moving across nearly 1,000 kilometers of terrain under military escort and drone surveillance, became the visible spine of this adaptation. But beneath that spectacle lay a quieter institutional transformation involving coordination between security services, transport unions, port authorities in Lomé, and Sahelian customs administrations recalibrating digital documentation flows to match new transit realities. Such coordination requires political discipline and bureaucratic agility, particularly in environments already strained by insurgent violence and fiscal limitations. Critics may argue that militarizing trade corridors is inherently unsustainable, pointing to the financial burden of armored escorts, fuel consumption, maintenance cycles, and intelligence operations necessary to deter attacks. And those concerns are not trivial. Sustained convoy protection imposes opportunity costs on defense budgets that might otherwise be directed toward stabilization efforts elsewhere. Yet the alternative, economic paralysis, would likely impose even greater social and political costs, including inflationary spirals, shortages of essential commodities, and potential unrest. In that sense, the corridor represents a calculated trade-off. Absorb heightened security expenditure in exchange for continuity of supply chains and preservation of state functionality. The ripple effects across the region reveal the interconnectedness of West African economies. When transit cargo shifted away from traditional routes through Cotonou and Abidjan, stakeholders in those ecosystems, truck drivers, freight brokers, warehouse operators, felt contraction, underscoring how sanction strategies reverberate beyond their primary targets. Meanwhile, Lomé's ascendance created incentives for infrastructure enhancement, potentially accelerating road rehabilitation projects and digital customs reforms designed to handle higher throughput efficiently. Over time, if these enhancements reduce transit time and transaction friction, the corridor could evolve from emergency workaround to competitive alternative even in the absence of sanctions. That possibility introduces a strategic dilemma for regional governance frameworks. Measures intended to coerce may catalyze diversification that permanently dilutes leverage. In geopolitical terms, diversification is insurance. For landlocked states historically reliant on a narrow set of maritime gateways, demonstrating that alternative access can be engineered under pressure alters future bargaining dynamics. Even if political conditions normalize and borders reopen fully, the memory of vulnerability and the proof of workaround remains embedded in policy thinking. Investors observing this period will factor resilience into risk models. If Lomé proves consistently reliable, capital may follow, embedding the corridor within broader West African trade circuits that extend towards Central Africa and beyond. Yet structural transformation is not guaranteed. Corridor durability hinges on security stabilization along transit routes, consistent policy alignment between Togo and Sahelian governments, and continued investment in customs modernization that reduces corruption risk and administrative bottlenecks. Any significant disruption, whether from insurgent targeting, political realignment, or infrastructural neglect, could undermine confidence and reintroduce volatility. This is where the stakes extend into long-term regional integration debates. ECOWAS was founded on principles of economic cooperation and free movement, but recent years have exposed tensions between normative enforcement and pragmatic interdependence. If sanction regimes incentivize alternative blocks or logistical alignments, the cohesion of the broader regional architecture could face strain. Conversely, the adaptive episode might prompt recalibration toward more nuanced engagement strategies that balance political principles with economic realities. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré's administration, the corridor's endurance offers both validation and responsibility. Validation, because survival under sanction pressure reinforces narratives of sovereignty and strategic resolve. Responsibility, because maintaining and upgrading the corridor requires sustained governance capacity and fiscal discipline. Domestic audiences may interpret convoy footage and expanding inland port facilities as tangible symbols of autonomy, but symbolism must translate into improved economic performance to secure lasting legitimacy. Reduced clearance delays, stabilized commodity prices, and transparent revenue management will determine whether the pivot becomes a foundation for growth rather than merely a shield against collapse. On a broader continental scale, the episode feeds into ongoing debates about Africa's infrastructural sovereignty and the diversification of trade partnerships. While the immediate pivot involved regional actors, it unfolds against a backdrop of global competition for influence, where ports, corridors, and logistics chains are increasingly strategic assets. Demonstrating the ability to reconfigure supply lines under pressure sends a signal to external partners that the Sahel is not entirely constrained by its geography. However, resilience does not eliminate structural challenges. Transporting goods across long overland distances remains costlier than efficient rail or pipeline networks, and sustained reliance on road convoys can strain infrastructure unless accompanied by investment in maintenance and modernization. The question, therefore, is not whether the Sahel survived the sanction phase. It did, but whether it can convert crisis adaptation into structural advancement. Will rail connectivity discussions gain momentum? Will customs digitalization reduce transit corruption and leakage? Will insurance premiums decline as corridor security stabilizes? These are the variables that determine whether redirection matures into transformation. From a strategic communications perspective, the narrative of building a new corridor to the sea under duress resonates strongly with younger audiences attuned to themes of autonomy and innovation under constraint. Yet the analytical lens must remain grounded. Adaptation under sanction pressure is an achievement, but it is not immunity from future shocks. Economic systems require redundancy, transparency, and integration to thrive sustainably. If the Lomé corridor becomes one pillar among several diversified pathways, the Sahel's bargaining position strengthens. If it becomes the sole fallback in a volatile security environment, vulnerabilities persist. As policymakers, investors, and regional institutions assess the aftermath of the sanction period, one insight stands out. Attempts to weaponize geography can produce unintended strategic creativity. The Sahel's pivot did not erase hardship, nor did it dissolve political tensions within ECOWAS, but it disrupted the assumption that landlocked status equates to strategic helplessness. That disruption alone recalibrates future calculations. In the end, what emerged was not a dramatic rupture, but a steady, deliberate redrawing of trade lines, convoy by convoy, customs stamp by customs stamp, until a functional maritime bridge through Lomé connected inland economies to global markets once again. Whether that bridge becomes a permanent artery or remains a testament to crisis-era ingenuity will depend on decisions unfolding now, in budget meetings, infrastructure tenders, security briefings, and diplomatic negotiations across West Africa. The sanctions sought to isolate. The response engineered connection. And in geopolitics, the capacity to engineer connection under pressure is often the difference between decline and durable adaptation.